Welcome back to Relationscapes, where we're mapping the stories and ideas that shape who we are and how we connect with each other in order to build a more just world. I'm journalist Blair Hodges, introducing our guide in this episode, Christina Cauterucci.
Queer history is my history too, and even though some of it feels hard for me to imagine, it's part of my life. And what I really want to do with this podcast is help other people feel that way too, to make this history feel present and intimate and real in a way that helps us understand the connection with the current moment.
One of the most consequential moments in American civil rights history has been forgotten. It played out just 4 years before I was born. It was 1978. Conservative politicians wanted to ban gays and lesbians from working in California public schools. The outcome of that statewide initiative would have huge repercussions for the rest of the country, and young gay activists knew it. The battle was on, and although it's been almost 50 years, their victory has surprising and urgent relevance for LGBTQ communities today. Journalist Christina Cauterucci tells the incredible story as host of Season 9 of Slate's podcast, Slow Burn, Gays Against Briggs. Christina joins us to talk about it right now. Christina Cauterucci, welcome to Relationscapes.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I want to kick the episode off by playing the trailer of your podcast, Slow Burn, Gays Against Briggs. Let's hear the trailer, and then we're going to talk about this amazing show that you've written, produced, and hosted. Here's the trailer for Slow Burn.
From Slate Podcasts.
So, first it was Dade County.
Voters in the Miami area repealed civil rights for gay people by a 2-to-1 margin.
In the late 1970s, cities around the country began rolling back anti-discrimination laws that protected gay people.
And then it was Wichita, St. Paul, Eugene.
Successful campaigns against the gay community, which shocked us all.
A state senator from California watched the laws fall and saw an opportunity.
Homosexuality is a most repulsive lifestyle.
His name was John Briggs, and he wanted to deliver the anti-gay movement its biggest prize yet.
California realized that they were coming for us.
I'm Christina Cauterucci. This season on Slow Burn, we'll explore how a nationwide backlash against gays and lesbians led to a massive showdown in California.
Now it's something called Proposition 6, the Briggs Initiative.
It would call for firing any teachers in California who practice homosexuality.
Your life as you knew it would be destroyed.
We've got to fight back. We can't let this happen in California.
The Briggs Initiative would be the first statewide vote on gay rights.
Gay rights now! Gay rights!
With so much at stake, young people became activists.
We were all coming out all day long, every day.
And activists became leaders.
My name is Harvey Milk, and I'm here to recruit you.
Slow Burn, Season 9, Gays Against Briggs. Out May 22nd, wherever you listen.
If we lose here, it'll be 50 years before we ever get back up again.
Like the drag queens say, take out the earrings, sharpen the nails. There ain't no going back.
All right, so this season focuses on the Briggs Initiative. And Christina, there's a lot of powerful stories from gay history. And on the surface, the Briggs Initiative doesn't seem like the most exciting part. So I wondered how you decided to focus on that as a whole season.
So right now, we are in a moment of a really intense backlash against queer and trans people led by right-wing politicians. There's been, over the past few decades, a really pretty quick increase in gay rights, gay visibility, also trans visibility and cultural relevance and power. And this has been really threatening to people on the right. The same exact thing was happening in the 70s. And so Slate felt that we could use this history podcast to kind of shed light on something important that happened back then that really doesn't make it into modern day history books, unless you're reading a specific gay history book, that sheds some light on what's going on right now, but also sheds a lot of light on something that happened back then that shaped a lot of the LGBTQ political movement that is fighting the backlash that's happening right now.
Describe the Briggs Initiative to us. Give us the mile-high view of what this was.
So the Briggs Initiative was a ballot initiative in 1978 that would have banned openly gay people from teaching or working in California public schools. It was introduced by a state senator, John Briggs, who was a right-winger from Orange County. And he really wanted to be governor of California, but he didn't have a lot of name recognition in the state. And so he had his ear to the ground and noticed that there was this anti-gay backlash sort of rising in response to the growing gay rights movement that really accelerated in 1969 with the Stonewall riots. So there was Anita Bryant with her anti-gay campaign in Florida, which popularized this idea that gay people were a danger to children. And so we need to rescind these tiny little footholds that gay people had gained in the political space. So there were some towns across the country, small cities, college towns that had passed non-discrimination laws against gay people. So there were starting to be right-wingers across the country who said, we need to take that away. There were a lot of repeal votes trying to rescind these advances that gay people had made. John Briggs thought, if I can attach my name to this issue, this is going to be my ticket to the California's governor's mansion. And so he put the initiative on the ballot, and in 1978, it was the first statewide vote on gay rights.
And you talked to Briggs's son, right, as part of your reporting. How did you get that interview? Because he seemed like a really interesting... It was actually kind of hard to pin him down exactly what he thought about.
Yeah, so Ron Briggs was one of my favorite interviews of the season. Early on, I knew, I really need to get some good perspective from the Briggs side, because there were a lot of queer people who wanted to talk to me about what they did to fight the Briggs Initiative. They were on the winning side and, the side that history has smiled upon. But I really wanted to be able to show what was going on inside the Briggs camp, especially because in a lot of histories of the Briggs Initiative, that side is really underdeveloped. So I knew that Ron Briggs was one of John Briggs' son. John Briggs is dead, so I couldn't interview him. And Ron Briggs, I knew, had also worked on the campaign. So he would also, not just be able to speak to who his dad was, but what the campaign was doing and why. So, I found his contact information through a public records database that journalists have access to. And I just gave him a call. And he said, no one ever wants to talk to me about this. They want to talk about another initiative that my dad had on the ballot, which was the death penalty, an expansion of the death penalty.
Yeah, it was kind of happening at the same time, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was the same year. That one passed, which really transformed California's relationship to the death penalty in what I think is a pretty disturbing way.
Yeah.
And Ron Briggs is somebody who, in years since, has become a man of faith. He's, joined the Catholic Church and has come out very strongly against the death penalty. So a lot of people wanted to talk to him about, what is it like to turn against your sort of family history on this issue. But no one ever talks to him about what has become known as the Briggs Initiative, the anti-gay ballot initiative. And so he was excited to talk about it. And one of the things he said to me on that first phone call was, my dad's dead now, so I can kind of say whatever I want. It doesn't matter. And I was like, oh, man, that is kind of the dream thing that a journalist wants to hear, because you really do want somebody to, be sharing the unvarnished memory of what transpired back then.
And you point out that he became religious. That's important to point out because John Briggs himself wasn't a huge Christian crusader or something, right? I think the stereotype people might have is that people like Anita Bryant, she was a very pro-Christian, Christian. That was her driving motivation, right? But with Briggs, that wasn't the case.
Yeah, a lot of the people I talked to had said he was really more opportunistic. And so, he was raised Christian and his wife was Catholic. And so he, I believe, converted to Catholicism when he married her, but the family never really went to church. He wasn't a religious crusader at all.
Yeah, he would have to convert to marry her, right? Like that, it wouldn't be like, oh, he had a conversion. Like, okay, if we're going to be able to get married, I got to join this church. All right,
yeah, it wasn't because he, had some big revelation of faith. And so he began using religious rhetoric as a cudgel against gay people just because that was sort of the vibe of what was going on at the time. Jerry Falwell was becoming really popular. The seeds of the moral majority were beginning to take root. Ronald Reagan was going to run for president in a couple years. And so he just kind of jumped on that bandwagon and did begin using a lot of religious rhetoric, but it wasn't because that was sort of a deeply held belief in and of himself. He was more out for himself.
And had you seen that a lot before you talked to Ron? Because that was something that seemed important for him, for the Sun, to talk about. And I don't know, that it seemed like he really wanted that part of the story in there.
Yeah, I think there had been a couple other people who had worked on Briggs's campaign who had spoken to the press over the years. And also a lot of gay people who sort of speculated, this guy didn't necessarily seem to fully believe what he was saying. A lot of people even said, I don't even know if he was that anti-gay. He just thought this was the best way to make his name in California politics. Ron did clarify that, yes, his dad was anti-gay. His dad really did believe that, the gay rights movement was going too far, too fast, and that, in his words, there was a group of people that needed to be corralled, and that it was wrong to have openly gay people in schools, having contact with children. But some of the more incendiary rhetoric that was popularized by Anita Bryant about gay people as, molesters, John Briggs was using that rhetoric, but it didn't seem like he was necessarily the biggest true believer on that front.
So Anita Bryant found success in Florida by focusing in on protecting the children and making it about children. As you looked into that history a little bit, did you sense that was kind of something they arrived at later on, or a primary concern? Because from what I've seen in the research, they really had moral problems with homosexuality, as they would term it at the time. And then they had to find ways to appeal to the broader public, right? It's almost like they didn't want to lead with Christianity in attacking gay people. They were Christian, they made that known, but they wanted to find reasons to attack homosexuality in ways that would appeal to anyone, quote unquote.
Right. It was a good way to make the issue, to give it a broad appeal. So they looked at what sort of avenues of criticism against gay people resonated most with the average person. And, people might not have a problem with, so for instance, the anti-discrimination bill that Anita Bryant worked to repeal protected queer people in housing and employment. And, people might not care whether they have a gay person living next to them in the apartment building, or whether there's a gay person working at the hair salon or at the grocery store. Mm-hmm. But they do care that gay people were teaching their children in schools, or they cared about, the idea of the moral decay that might transpire if gay people were teaching the next generation and, indoctrinating them into this immoral lifestyle. So there was a lot less of a sense of, we can kind of live and let live with gay people in schools. And so that's what led Anita Bryant and her allies, including John Briggs, who actually went down to help her in Florida, to adopt that as their main message.
Maybe take a second, too, to define what a wedge issue is. For people that haven't really been very politically minded, it might sound surprising, or maybe unsurprising, that a politician would just pick an issue and try to run all the way to office on it. So talk about what a wedge issue is and how that typically works.
I mean, there's a lot of voters out there who, maybe don't have a lot of really strong feelings one way or another on a lot of political issues, or maybe they're not super partisan. But there might be an issue out there that evokes a strong emotional response and a lot of fear or a lot of anger. These are really good wedge issues, which force people to choose a side. And John Briggs used gay rights as that issue because it evoked a lot of fear in people who were watching this community that they knew very little about, gay people. They were just starting to, I found these old news reports from the 70s that were basically reporting on gay people almost like a National Geographic safari. Like, here's their neighborhood in San Francisco, and this is what a glory hole is. And can you believe it? And, there are people around the country who certainly had gay people in their communities, but there weren't a lot of people out yet necessarily. And so they didn't know they were living among gay people. So the idea that these people were sort of infiltrating the culture, becoming politically powerful, maybe in your schools, was really frightening to people. And so it was a very effective way for John Briggs, Anita Bryant, and other people around the country to get everyday voters to choose a side and, become sort of politically active and animated and passionate in a way that they might not have about, any other issue, housing policy or something.
And if you can get those voters out there, they're likely to vote for a particular political party, too. So there's a way to use wedge issues to achieve political power, to get not just a ballot initiative, which could matter, but also to elect the kind of politicians who are using that wedge issue. So I think it's a way to both go after gay people or to excite voters for a particular cause like a ballot initiative, but also to help shore up political power for the party that's using the wedge issue.
Right, for their whole agenda. And so they were using gay people to get in office to enact a really broad right-wing agenda. And, John Briggs was really hoping that his first challenge in becoming governor was the Republican primary. So he wanted to get the ballot initiative on the ballot for the Republican primary in 1978. And so that, really animated conservatives would come out and vote for the guy who was leading the crusade against gay people. But he messed up the petitions in a really stupid way. And so he had to throw out all those petitions. And so he didn't end up winning the gubernatorial primary and wasn't on the ballot in November when the ballot initiative ran. But the point still stood that this was going to hopefully bring people out to vote for Republicans because they were so amped up about the anti-gay issue.
So we get to hear from Briggs's son, and your interviews with him are terrific. We also get to hear from people who it was directly affecting. I really loved hearing from Tom Amiano. Tell us a little bit about him.
Oh, man. Tom Amiano is a real character, and he was so much fun to talk to. Tom was a teacher in the 1970s. He was from New Jersey and has a very beautiful and intense Jersey accent.
It's awesome. His voice is perfect.
Yeah. I actually got a chance to talk to a former preschool student of his. He taught in a school in the Mission District in San Francisco and became a really big advocate for bilingual students or students who were learning English as their second language. And just, became a beloved member of the community. And he, before the Briggs Initiative, had become an activist for his own community of gay teachers because the San Francisco School District did not protect teachers who were gay or lesbian. They had anti-discrimination protections based on race and gender, but not sexual orientation. And, at the time, sodomy was illegal in California up until 1975 and almost everywhere else in the country. And so if you were convicted of sodomy, gay sex, your teaching license could be suspended or revoked because criminals can't teach. And so this was a major threat to gay people, especially gay men who were teachers. Gay people were presumed criminals, so they were sort of forcibly closeted. In San Francisco, it was a little bit more like, don't ask, don't tell. You shouldn't really be trumpeting in and you're not going to have a problem versus some other places in the country where you had to be fully hidden. But Tom led a crusade and started a group of gay teachers. They lobbied the school board, got the policy changed. And then when the Briggs Initiative came along a few years later, he was ready to fight back against that too. And for him, it was really personal because he felt like there were these two parts of his life that were finally able to converge into, a single identity and a single person and a single life, and not like, he was a teacher during the day and a gay man at night and on the weekends, that he was just one person who could really be himself at work.
Or also that at any moment it could all be taken away,
Right.
As you said, there's kind of a don't ask, don't tell, but that's still a really precarious way to live.
Totally.
And people were leaning into the stereotype of it would be dangerous to have gay people in the classroom, either because they could groom or brainwash the kids into becoming gay, or because gay people themselves were perceived as being predatory. The biggest problem with both of those fears, I think, is that there is absolutely no data or any proof that either of those things is remotely true. Why didn't that matter at the time?
I mean, it didn't matter because it was politically beneficial to pretend that it was true, and there was nothing to prove otherwise. There were, people didn't know very many gay people in their lives. In places like San Francisco, it was different, but there were very few places around the country where there was sort of a robust, thriving, visible gay community. And it was really easy to, pick and choose stereotypes too from those visible gay communities of they're sex obsessed and they're having public sex all the time and sort of extrapolate that to create this narrative that gay people are like solely defined by the sex that they have and thus a danger to children. And, when there's stereotype or a fear that proves very powerful in helping a group of politicians and powerful people retain that power, then there is every incentive to promote that narrative. And there also wasn't a lot of research about gay people at the time, so you're not going to be able to come out with facts. I mean, even now, in all areas of politics, coming out with facts doesn't matter because it's very easy to, on an issue that creates emotions like this, focus on the emotions rather than what's actually happening.
As you were talking about that, a person came to mind from the podcast. I don't remember their name, and I don't even remember if they played any kind of central role, but it was a person who was a kid in the Midwest or something, and I think growing up in a religious household and knew he was gay, but also had been taught that was evil and wrong and that it was criminal. And all he could think about was like, oh no, like my life will be ruined. I'm going to have to grow up and become this horrible, evil criminal. But then in the 1970s, there started to be more and more awareness of San Francisco, especially as a place where there were gay people just living their lives. And he somehow got clued into that, and it just opened up this whole world to him. I think of The Wizard of Oz when Dorothy opens the door, the black and white, and walks out into this world of color where like his whole future changed. He went from this person who felt completely isolated and as though he had to be a criminal to someone who had possibilities in his life.
Yeah. I think you're speaking of Cleve Jones, who his family, they were Quakers, and they were very progressive, actually. They were involved in the civil rights movement. But, he had this sense, and it was later borne out by a conversation he had with them, that if they ever found out he was gay, they would have committed him. And, the only depictions of gay people that he ever saw in the media were, either people leading these very lonely, sad lives, or, maybe dying by suicide, which was really a very common trope in depictions of queer people back then, and, almost up until the present. Or that they were these degenerates, they were criminals. Sodomy was illegal, like I said, and so it really was illegal to be gay in many places. And so he was a junior in high school, and he came across an issue of Life magazine in the school library where he was skipping gym class. He kind of like faked a lung issue to get out of gym because that's where he was bullied the most. And he was in the library, found this issue of Life magazine, I think it was 1971, where it was like the gay rights movement. And it was like, there's this new sort of political movement that's growing in New York and San Francisco and maybe LA and Washington, D.C., where these homosexuals who are people who, love the same gender, like they're actually demanding rights now. Yeah. And it was, totally revelatory for him because he was like, oh, not only are there many other people like that out there in the world, but they're actually leading like proud lives. They're not just leading their lives in shame. They're having lovers and friends and activities, and they're so proud of themselves and think so highly of themselves that they believe they deserve rights. And so he came to San Francisco, and really, I mean, the way he talked about it, it really was like arriving in Oz, where he feels like for the very first time, he's able to live the life that he really didn't think would ever be possible for him. And so many people who I talked to, women and men who moved to San Francisco in that time, which, by the way, 100,000 gay people moved to San Francisco over a period of about 7 years in the 70s, which was a seventh of the city's population. It really transformed the city and transformed 100,000 people's lives because they came from all over the country to this one place where they believed they could live as themselves and actually have some approximation of the life heterosexual people were leading all over the country. I mean, that was some of my favorite parts of reporting the podcast, was talking to people about that moment because it really was magical for them. And they were able to show affection in public. They were able to experience queer art making and become involved in politics for the first time. Even if they didn't think that's what they wanted to do when they moved to San Francisco, a lot of people were drawn into politics because of Anita Bryant and John Briggs, who kind of made it impossible to ignore that there was this anti-gay backlash looming and threatening their rights.
San Francisco is such a fascinating part of the story you tell. And I have to say, the podcast does such a good job of taking us there because it's a place that represented a sense of growing power and possibility for gay people. But it's also a place where fear and persecution were following close behind. So there's really a tension also, right? It was a wonderful sort of mecca, but there were also difficulties in San Francisco that people were facing. So talk about that tension there, the potential for the power and growth, but also it wasn't a perfect place either. There was plenty of fear and persecution there as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was because it was a place where gay people could be visible and there was like thriving gay nightlife in this growing gayborhood.
A gay club with windows on the outside where you could actually see inside.
Right. The first one in the country.
Yeah.
Which still exists today.
And you went to it.
Yeah. There were people who would come to the Castro, which was the gayborhood in San Francisco, every night to try to beat up on gay people. There were dozens of gay bashings happening over a period of a month or two, even during this period of gay rights taking hold in San Francisco and elsewhere. And so gay people were living in fear still, just for being visible and being out. And that's not to mention the legal threats that were looming. And so in Anita Bryant's campaign in Florida, she used in her television ads videos of gay pride in San Francisco or the Castro in San Francisco to show, there's this like modern day Sodom and Gomorrah here in our very own United States. And so they really were being presented to the outside world as this sort of encapsulation of everything that was going wrong with the morals of America and America's sort of moral decay. And in addition to the gay bashings, there were plenty of politicians in California who didn't believe that gay people deserved rights as well. But because there was this concentration of people, it also became the birthplace of some of the first political movements where gay and lesbians were working together. And the Briggs Initiative provided this reason for people to kind of come out of the woodwork and join up together on a single issue.
Yeah, and there were differences of opinion on this too, right? Like about what exactly they should do, what the tactics should look like. So talk about we have the LGBTQ plus movement now, right? But that coalition is still trying to figure out how it's a coalition. And back then it was even more just kind of everybody kind of all over the place. Lots of different options, lots of different perspectives. So talk about the different coalitions that were starting to form and some of the different negotiations that were happening about what should we focus on, how should we do it, what was happening.
So once it became clear that the Briggs Initiative was probably going to end up on the ballot and that it was a imminent threat to gay life in California and all across the country, by the way, I should mention, because it was going to be the first vote on gay rights, the first statewide vote on gay rights, it was really seen as a bellwether for what the gay rights movement could achieve and how far the anti-gay backlash could go, because the anti-gay backlash had won not just in Florida, but in several other cities across the country that had repealed their own anti-discrimination laws by popular vote.
So goes California, so goes the nation.
Exactly, especially because it was the gayest state in the nation. So at that point, once this all became clear, gay people across the state realized, okay, we're going to have to fight this. But at first, some people didn't actually think that was even the right thing to do. Some of the more, sort of small c conservative gays, mostly white gay men, mostly wealthier, more well-connected, thought, we're never going to win this. We're going to let John Briggs win and then take it to the Supreme Court and try to get them to strike it down. Eventually, some activists convinced those people to change their minds, which was important because they had the money that would end up funding a lot of the fight against the Briggs Initiative. But that school of thought became what I like to call don't say gay after the Florida law, because they ended up thinking, we can't make this about gay rights. We have to talk about human rights and, freedom and liberty. And this is a school of thought that will sound very familiar to people today because, like you said, it's still an issue that there's a lot of differences of opinions on.
And privacy.
Right. It's not just about gay people or even gay teachers. It's about like anyone's right to live their own private lives. And those people also thought, gay men who are feminine and flamboyant shouldn't be out front. Certainly no gender nonconforming people. They didn't actually talk a lot about, trans people at the time because people use different languages and there was, people identified in different ways back then. But they were very much, only really respectable, gay men in suits and should sort of be out front on this issue. but preferably straight people, preferably no gay people at all speaking about this. Then there were sort of on the other end of the political spectrum, the more grassroots organizers who really thought we need to confront this issue head on. We need to not only talk about this as an issue of gay rights, but confront the myths that are spreading about gay people as brainwashers and groomers and molesters and, being a danger to children.
And perverts and sexually deviant.
Right. And, just saying, that's not true and addressing instead of ignoring that the right wing was using that argument, confronting it and saying there's absolutely no data to prove that. And in fact, if you look at, they pulled data from, the FBI and a couple other sources to say, actually, the most likely person to molest a child is a heterosexual man, most often a relative of the victim. And so, these were people who really wanted to get unions involved because it's a workers' issue. The Briggs Initiative would override teachers' union contracts, which is a huge deal. And they made some of the very first alliances between the LGBTQ rights movement and the labor movement, which would prove extraordinarily powerful.
This is how you start to see the alliances, like why a lot of queer people today might align with Democrats, for example, like union movements, like leftist politics. This is where today's political alignments are really starting to kind of really lock in.
Oh, yeah. And then there was a group sort of in the middle. And this was a group that would end up being led in part by Harvey Milk, who's, one of the best known gay rights icons in the U.S.
And can I just say your coverage of the Milk part of this is beautiful.
Thank you.
Really moved me to hear the recordings of Milk. People need to go listen to the show to hear the Milk stuff. If you've seen Milk, you've got to go hear the recordings. You've got to go hear his voice. You've got to go hear the voices of people that knew him. You reported this out so well.
Thank you so much. It was definitely one of the most fascinating parts of this project for me because, I consider myself pretty well versed on gay history, but I don't feel like I fully understood Harvey Milk until I did this project and talking to so many people about why he was special. And why he resonated so deeply with people as a leader. And he was only in office for a year. When the Briggs Initiative was ramping up, he was just running for the third time to be a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, which is their city council. He finally won that election, in part because he made himself out to be somebody who could oppose the Briggs Initiative. Even though that wasn't a San Francisco-specific issue, he said, we need a visible, strong leader to oppose John Briggs. Because the LGBTQ movement was not a movement at the time. There were a few, like a smattering of organizations around the US, but really only a couple national groups that were just getting started. They were just a year or two old, many of them. And there was no political experience in fighting an anti-gay initiative because it hadn't happened before. There had never been a statewide vote on gay rights. And so Harvey Milk, using the renown that he had earned, hard-earned through his own grassroots efforts, registering voters and being a neighborhood advocate in San Francisco, to bring people together in a little bit more of a middle-of-the-road way. And so he was really focused on a traditional campaign strategy of knocking on doors, registering people to vote across the state, and sort of getting out the vote. And so he and his group knocked doors in every single precinct in San Francisco, even the neighborhoods that were hostile to gay people, which there were, if you can believe it, in San Francisco.
Especially old-timers, people that had been there before this huge influx of...
Exactly. And who were probably a little more radicalized against gay people because of the big influx, that had really changed their communities.
Sure.
Or pushed them out of their communities. And so there were these kind of three strains of thought, and there was some fighting. Definitely people disagreed with each other. And then they kind of ended up not even overcoming their differences, but just kind of agreeing to each go their own way. And I think history shows that they really each played an essential part of the campaign. So there were, the sort of don't say gay gays. They provided the funding that bankrolled this statewide ad campaign that was super powerful, very sophisticated. And, I'm sure their message resonated with some voters. The grassroots people brought the unions on board. And they did a lot of outreach to communities of color. In addition to Gwen Craig, who was an ally of Harvey Milk's, who was this incredible Black lesbian who went out to Black churches and Black pastors. And, these were communities that historically gay rights groups had kind of ignored in their campaigns. And of course, there were plenty of gays of color, but the communities were very segregated at the time.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, they're often ignored in gay history, too. Like, your reporting was some of the first that I heard of those particular people, which was a fantastic part of the reporting, too.
Yeah, because a lot of the big names in gay history, because of racism, were white people. Those were the people being elevated to the tops of their organizations. And queer people of color felt really alienated by these, mainstream gay rights groups. And so gay rights groups would even, not reach out to straight communities of color because they assumed that those people would be super homophobic and, weren't even worth trying to convince. The Campaign Against the Briggs Initiative didn't abide by that. They recognized that as potentially one of the reasons why the gay rights movement lost in Miami-Dade County in Florida, because they had written off, Latino communities. This was also one of the first times that gay men and lesbians worked together. There was a lot of mistrust between the genders in gay communities in the 70s and earlier, because men and women really felt like their interests were not necessarily aligned because they were persecuted in different ways. And so for gay men, there was a lot of raids on gay bars, which women experienced too, but to a little bit of a lesser extent. There were men being, arrested and convicted of sodomy. And they were really concerned with their ability to, be able to have sex without being persecuted for it. Queer women and lesbians at the time, they were often having their children taken away from them in custody battles. They would, have a divorce with their husband, and their husband would go to family court and say, look, this woman's a lesbian and she is not fit to be a mother to these children that we have together. And she would never be able to see her children again. And that was one of their big issues at the time. But they recognized that the Briggs Initiative was going to affect all of them. And so there was a lot of education done by lesbians to try to make gay men understand how some of the things that they were doing were sexist. So only featuring men in their brochures, or calling women girls, or, using the word bitch, or things like that, where, they had to overcome a lot of barriers to be able to work together. But they did, and it would really prove to be an important moment in gay rights, not just because of what they did with the Briggs Initiative, but because just a few years later, the AIDS crisis began. And because of some of the bonds that were built in this moment and in other movements around the country, lesbians were really able to step up and help care for gay men in that terrible time.
So Slow Burn does a great job setting up all these different perspectives, the different communities that were coming together or coming apart to try to figure out what to do in the face of this political opposition. That's Christina Cauterucci. She's a journalist at Slate, and we're talking about Slow Burn, Gays Against Briggs, a terrific podcast series. You should go listen to it now. I know you're going to want to binge it because you're going to want to find out what happens, everything that we just set up, what happens with the Briggs Initiative, who comes together, what happens to Harvey Milk. All the questions that you still have, you'll need to go to Slow Burn to hear those, because I want to talk, Christina, to you more about your own personal stakes in this. So as you started to dig into all the different coalitions and different perspectives within gay communities, you're a queer reporter yourself. Did you find yourself feeling more sympathetic to any particular group? I can't help but sort of throw myself into the history and see like where my temperament might fit, or where I'm kind of a pragmatist and like where would I fit? Did you find yourself doing that?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I talked to people from, all three of sort of the main schools of thought. And I definitely felt myself more drawn to the grassroots activists who were sort of in your face and unapologetic. And, especially at the time, to me, that felt like a necessary corrective to some of the gay activism before Stonewall, which was very important and underappreciated in history often. But, after Stonewall and as sort of the 70s progressed, I feel like, that sort of facing the issue head on and not being afraid to say, like, yes, I'm gay and this is what gay culture is, that appeals to me a lot. And I still think that that's a powerful way to do activism today. But I can really see where all the groups are coming from. And I think they each played a really important part in the fight against the Briggs Initiative. And honestly, I feel like that's sort of the biggest takeaway for me, was that people don't have to agree to be working as part of the same movement and toward the same goals. And especially because different messages will resonate with different types of people. And I happen to think that the respectability politics way of doing things, where, let's make ourselves as small and unoffensive as possible in hopes that people will like us, I don't think that that's proved to have work in any social movement. I know that's been a big argument within movements for civil rights and racial justice too, about, how much should we sort of try to assimilate or fit ourselves into a mold so that people might think kindly on us. And this was a really fascinating lens into those arguments and how they sort of played out in this particular moment in 1978.
You said that in the 6 months that you spent really immersed in the story as you were reporting it out, transformed your relationship to queer history. What was it before you started reporting this, and how did it change?
I think I had a little bit of a detached relationship to queer history. You know, I hadn't done a lot of historical research or interviews, and so, you know, it didn't feel present and real as much as I sort of appreciated, you know, what people went through to allow me to live the life that I do. I didn't feel necessarily emotionally connected to it or like these people's lives were anything like mine. But it was weird. I mean, as I talked to so many of the incredible people who were involved in this fight against the Briggs Initiative, that history both felt further away and closer to my current life than it did before. And I can explain what I mean. So, you know, Harvey Milk would often use Holocaust analogies to explain what was so frightening about this campaign against queer people, you know, pointing out that Hitler went after Jewish teachers, and that was sort of one of the first groups that were persecuted in Nazi Germany, you know, and so he was trying to say, look, they're coming after gay teachers first, everyone's next, and there's going to be a registry, and, you know, people were really, really, really scared about what this could portend for queer communities, in part because they were very close in history to Nazi Germany, like closer to that than we are to them. And so that made it feel like, oh my gosh, this really was a long, long time ago. Mm-hmm. And at a time when it was almost impossible for a queer young person to come up in the world and think that they could lead anything approaching a normal, normal in quotes, life, or a fulfilling and full life. That experience was rare to impossible. And I don't think I fully grasped the severity and the sort of homogeneity of that experience for people coming of age at that time, that even if you lived in a progressive family or a city, it was really hard for you to imagine what a happy life for yourself, a full life for yourself. So that made it feel a lot further away and sort of made me appreciate, oh my gosh, you know, things have changed so much. And my experience coming of age was so different. And at the same time, you know, talking to these people.
Maybe quickly say something about that. Like, did you grow up in a family where, like, when did you come out and was it acceptable? Like, what kind of community were you in?
Yeah, so I grew up in, came of age, spent my teen years in New Hampshire, in, you know, a suburb of Manchester, New Hampshire, which certainly there were gay people who I knew. My student council advisor was gay. One of my guidance counselors was gay. But those were kind of the only two gay people that I knew, and their lives didn't necessarily look like what I wanted my life to look like, or I didn't see myself in them. Also didn't know I was gay at the time and sort of didn't consider that as a possibility for myself. Grew up in a Catholic family. You know, we didn't talk about gay issues much. We certainly weren't like a homophobic family. We weren't really a political family at all. And it wasn't until college when I really started to, you know, explore my desires and realize that, like, oh, actually this thing that sort of was happening in the back of my head as like something that I didn't need to consider actually might be who I am and how I want to live my life. And, you know, I didn't know at all how my family would react. And even at the time, there was actually a very intense moment that I remember where I was like, oh yeah, that whole future that I had sort of lackadaisically imagined for myself just isn't going to happen. And I actually don't know what's going to take its place. And, you know, there were a lot of gay rights we have now that we didn't have then, even in, you know, the 2000s. So like gay marriage and employment protections. And even though that's pretty recent history, queer life looked different then. And I still was very happy and excited, though. And that's sort of the main difference, is that even though I didn't really know what could happen, and I was like, oh yeah, I don't know if I'll ever be able to get married or have kids, or which, you know, I soon realized I didn't even want kids. But like, you know, all of these things that seem more complicated for gay people back then, like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that, but I don't care. And I know that I'm going to have like a full and happy life because I see gay communities out there, and I know some more gay people now, and I can envision
TV.
a future for myself. Yeah, right. There's like Will and Grace was on, and even though there wasn't necessarily like a culture that I could very easily plug into, which now I feel like the queer women's culture that resonates more with me, like actually is in mainstream culture and a lot more visible. And in fact, we're like in a moment of cultural supremacy, I think. But anyway, I was able to feel that sort of excitement and possibility in a way that the people of, a generation and a half ago, or maybe 2 generations ago, who I spoke to for the series, were not able to experience. And so I feel like if I had grown up in that generation, would I have just continued dating men? I know for some people that wasn't possible. For me, it felt like maybe that would have been what I chose to do, and just sort of consign myself to less of a full and happy existence, because it might have been the easier thing to do, where I could have sort of convinced myself that that was what I wanted. And yeah, that talking to them about our different experiences, just like a few decades apart, was really, really impactful to me. But at the same time, the way they talked about their lives back then, the conversations they were having in their communities about politics, what their social lives were like, the things that they wanted, the things that they found funny, their protest chants. It felt so contemporary to me and so present. And it just made me feel like there is this queer history and queer legacy that I'm a part of and they're a part of. And there's some sort of continuity there and links between us that are strong and that have lasted. And that was so powerful for me to understand at such an intimate level. And, making connections with some of the people I interviewed, that felt like we had this sort of a level of intimacy sort of early on in the interview that would have been hard for me to create with somebody else, because we share this queer community together. I feel like they trusted me more, and I knew what questions to ask them, and it made me feel like queer history is my history too, even though I didn't live it, even though some of it feels hard for me to imagine. It's part of my life, and it was such a gift. And what I really want to do with this podcast is help other people feel that way too, to make this history feel present and intimate and real in a way that helps us understand the connection with the current moment.
I wanted to ask you about that. Did you ever feel exhausted or put off because some of the things that they were chanting, you're listening to these old recordings with these chants, and these chants could still be said at a protest today. And I just wondered if that felt kind of exhausting.
Yeah, I mean, some of my favorite audio of this season, and the audio I was most excited to find, was from these old protests. That it really brings you into that moment, hearing people in moments of fear and anger and passion, speaking what it's like in that moment. And yeah, sometimes hearing what they're saying and the fears that they're describing to the reporters made me feel like, oh, wow, we haven't moved very far. And we're still fighting the same narratives today. I felt it also listening to audio of anti-gay activists at the time, and John Briggs and Anita Bryant using some of the same exact language that Republican legislators and right-wing activists are using today, where I'm like, oh my God, we haven't beaten this back. It's still, they believe it's effective still.
That's what triggered me, by the way, is those recordings, and especially seeing how they've been transferred over into especially trans issues. Like some of the exact same arguments are being made now more specifically about trans folks today, about being groomers or a threat to people, or they shouldn't be in public, they shouldn't be teachers, they shouldn't be, now we're seeing bathroom discourse. It's like, and I'm just like, wow, this is the same stuff.
Yeah, and, part of the campaign to defeat that rhetoric was coming out. This was another difference of opinion where older generations really felt like, let's not all come out, because we're leading our lives quietly. And if there's a spotlight on us, then we're really going to suffer some of the more intense effects of that hate and repression, which, of course, that was a little bit of a privileged position to take. Not everyone could hide themselves in a way that protected them from persecution. But the argument that won out, and this was one really championed by Harvey Milk, was we have to come out, because if people don't know who we are and they don't know that they're interacting with us every single day, not only in schools, but in their churches, in their workplace, in their own families, then they're never going to vote for us. They're never going to believe that we're people deserving of rights. That was so powerful back then. And today, I mean, that argument for visibility, I don't think holds as much weight, because people do know that gay people and trans people are everywhere. In fact, that's part of what has spurred this backlash. And it did back then, too. It was the growing visibility of queer people that caused the sort of fear that Republicans were able to capitalize on. But today, it feels like the, growing visibility of trans people is the reason why the right has been able to suggest that they're worthy of repression and that they don't deserve to be around your children. And in fact, if they are your children, if the trans person is your child, then and you're supporting them, then you don't deserve to be a parent to them at all, and your rights as a parent should be taken away. That's the just really disturbing part.
Yeah, you become the abuser or the groomer.
Exactly. And we're seeing laws to that effect in Texas. And so, yeah, I agree with you that it's disturbing to hear that rhetoric back then because of how present it is, and because I think the tactics that they used in the campaign to defeat it might not be as effective now.
You did such a good job as a journalist because sometimes you would be wrapping up a point or describing a position as a reporter straightforwardly that would make me upset or just, that perspective really bothers me, or I disagree with that so much, because as a journalist, you have to tell the story. And so there are so many times when you're just describing something that could be really traumatic, I think, for queer people to hear, but you're using your reporter's voice, you're saying it straightforwardly. And I just wondered what that was like for you to record those parts where you're like, all right, I'm going to tell the story. I have to do this, even if some of the things you were saying could be really hurtful.
Yeah. I mean, we definitely determined early on that this wasn't going to be a podcast where people didn't know what side I was on. Like, I think it's a pretty safe position to take as a reporter that, like, yeah, gay people shouldn't be banned from public schools. That doesn't feel super controversial.
Yeah.
And especially as a person with personal stakes in the issue, I wasn't going to pretend like I cared equally about both of these sides. That, this, you're not going to come away from the podcast thinking that I'm a neutral observer.
But you still did a good job, like, giving their best case, right?
Yeah,
this is what I'm saying, is like, what you didn't do was turn Anita Bryant and John Briggs into these caricatures of evil who were sort of crusading against truth and righteousness. You really gave them their best shot because you let them make their best case. And sometimes as a reporter, you had to do this. This is what I'm saying is, like, sometimes you're letting them give their best shot, and I'm just like, oh.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And actually, it was interesting. So, Ron Briggs is someone who I interviewed who has since decided, not long after the campaign, and we hear about one specific turning point within the campaign where he started to turn against it, but he now very much believes that they were on the wrong side of history.
Yeah.
He supports gay rights, even though he's a Republican still. But there was someone else I interviewed, LaGarde Smith, who was an ally of John Briggs and really sort of a true believer, Christian, right-wing activist or conservative. And he still believes they did the right thing, that openly gay people, closeted gay people are a different story. Whatever, a closeted gay, if you don't know they're gay, they can do what they want. But an openly gay person should not be, speaking about gay issues to children, or necessarily, if a student knows that they're gay, that alone is sort of indoctrination, and gay people shouldn't be in schools. He thinks that the same law should be passed today. And, that was a little bit of a difficult interview because I wanted him to be able to share his perspective and explain his thinking without feeling like I was going to sort of jump down his throat or say that he was wrong, because I think it's important to know where people are coming from when they believe that kind of a thing.
That's right.
And, we had a perfectly fine interview. And then he emailed me after the publication of the podcast, because I sent it to him when it came out. And he was like, thank you so much for giving me my fair shot and allowing me to explain my case for your show. And, it just kind of strikes me that my side has never really figured out how to make a good case for this issue. I guess having listened to some of the other people like John Briggs, Anita Bryant, and some other clips of pastors who would say, gay people should be exterminated or something like that. And he's like, we really don't know how to make the right case for this issue. I thought that was really interesting because I think it just goes to show that, when you take a really extreme position that is based on hate and persecution of a specific group, other people who believe that thing are going to take that extreme position even further in ways that really turn off the general public, because that whole gay people should be exterminated part was a bridge too far for almost everyone else in California who heard that. And so in some ways, allowing these perpetrators of anti-gay sentiment and policy to make their own case is the best way to turn their case against them.
I agree. And I think the podcast does a good job of letting people make their case, but presenting multiple sides of the story. And you're not inflating, I call it the CNN fallacy, which is like, okay, we're going to talk about climate change. We have Dr. Smith here, who's studied climate for years on this side, and then we have Bill over here, and we're going to give them both 5 minutes to, like, that's not, that's like this false equivalency, right? So you don't raise it to that level, but you do let people make their case because, like you said, I think it's really important that we understand the stakes and that we understand the arguments that are being made against the rights of ourselves and of people that we love, so that we can address those points and that we can be prepared when we have to make a public case for the rights that we are fighting for.
Yeah, definitely.
That's Christina Cauterucci, journalist at Slate. You can hear her on the podcast Slow Burn, Gays Against Briggs. It's a terrific show. She's also a senior writer and a host of Outward, which is Slate's podcast on queer life. So, Christina, I already mentioned that we're seeing a lot of the same arguments happening around trans rights today that we've seen with gay rights in the past. And one of your guests made this point that they're a little more frightened today than they were back then. We're seeing a pretty big backlash right now, a huge rise in anti-trans bills in legislatures across the country. And I wondered what you're thinking at this moment, the kind of lessons that we can take from the work you did in Slow Burn in how we're thinking about what we're facing at the present.
It was very striking for me to hear from several of the gay people I interviewed who were, essential parts of the movement back then, that what they're seeing today is even worse than what they saw in the 1970s. And it just goes to show that rights are never solid and progress is never permanent. But as far as actual lessons that we can take from them, I mean, I think the fact that, the coming out campaign that they waged, where thousands of people across the state were coming out in public, not just to people they knew, but literally handing out business cards wherever they went, saying, you just sat on the bus next to a gay person just served you your coffee. Like, this was an argument that tamping yourself down and hiding and being quiet is not a way to win political support and political rights. And I think that's a lesson that we can definitely take today, that, people who are suggesting that, trans people are being a little too much in public, or, why can't you just gender conform a little, or why do you have to be so weird all the time? These are not arguments that should hold any weight, because there's not a large population of voters out there who are just okay, well, if you're nice enough and if you're respectable enough, then sure, I'll give you some rights as a treat. That's not how it works, and it's not a way to build lasting social change. I think that's a major lesson from this movement. Another one is that different perspectives can all work, don't even have to really work together, but can work alongside each other toward the same goal. And so, these people didn't spend a ton of time dwelling on the facts that they all had different perspectives. They just went out and did the work.
You didn't see them spending a lot of time going after each other, right? We see a lot of friendly fire happening, especially on social media, where people can spend a lot of time telling other people who they agree with on a lot of stuff, kind of attacking their method or their approach.
Yeah.
You didn't see a lot of that back then in the records.
No, I mean, and part of it was because we didn't have social media back then. Yeah. I actually think it's kind of funny to imagine what these people would have been like on social media.
Yeah, that might have been a problem.
Yeah. And, certainly it's fair and right to criticize people when they deserve it. But I do think one of the things that they did really well back then was just doing what they believed would work and sort of focusing on their own communities and their own strategies.
So it's if your full-time work is critiquing work, maybe find new work. Maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. But, another thing that I really took from reporting this season was that people will do anything to gain political power. And the incentive to demonize a minority group for political gain is something that has been very constant across the arc of American politics. Mm-hmm. And so it certainly comes as no surprise that one of the most vulnerable minorities in the United States right now, trans children, has become the victim of some of the most virulent attacks on queer people today. A group that doesn't have the right to vote yet and doesn't have a lot of visibility to speak up for themselves, But what the people did back then to fight the Briggs Initiative, I think has created a climate where a lot more people today feel like they are able to speak up for themselves in some way. And we're seeing incredible bravery and tenacity and resilience among trans youth today. And one thing that I've learned from other reporting that I've done on movements for trans rights and the current anti-trans movement that has made it, illegal for trans kids to receive gender-affirming care or identify as their own gender in schools or what have you, is that there are certain things that politics can't take away. So they can make it illegal to access essential life-saving gender-affirming medical care, but they can't take away community support, parental support, which there are so many more parents and teachers and doctors and social workers who are competent and caring and know about and support trans youth today than would have ever been possible back then. And that's the kind of thing that can't be legislated away, and that can make all the difference in whether somebody is able to live a full and fulfilling life, which isn't to say that the political stuff is any less important, but the cultural change that the movement against the Briggs Initiative really helped kick off in the sort of way it made people work together and building the sort of politically sophisticated movement that we see today, that's still having a beneficial effect on what we're able to do. And as scary as it can be to see where politics in the US is going, especially for trans people, especially for trans children, I find a little bit of hope in knowing that even when politics look really bleak, there's still a lot of support that they can't take away.
That's Christina Cauterucci. We're talking about the podcast Slow Burn, Gays Against Briggs. Let's talk regrets, challenges, and surprises. Christina, this is an opportunity for you to choose one of these, or all three if you want, but something that you would change about the show now that it's all produced, it's out, it's ready for people to listen to front to back. What the most challenging part of producing it was, or something that really surprised you in the course of reporting it out?
Okay, well, I'll say a small regret, but then I want to talk about a surprise. So I started reporting this show last fall of 2023. And, it
By
started...
the way, that's super fast. You listen to tons of tape. And knowing what it takes to produce a show, I thought it took longer to make.
Thank you.
It's awesome.
Yeah, I think I started full-time on it in November, and we published at the end of May. I did have a team of people working with me on this.
Sure.
But I started, just by doing a lot of reading about what had already been published about the fight against the Briggs Initiative. Mm-hmm. And I came across a few mentions of this woman, Amber Hollabaugh, who you'll hear about in the show as, just this incredible, bleach blonde, working class, high femme lesbian who did some of the bravest and most innovative campaigning against the Briggs Initiative by going out to small rural towns like the ones that she was from to not leave those voters behind and to not believe that they would just automatically vote against gay people and to say, look here, you want to meet a gay person? Here I am. Ask me literally whatever you want. She was amazing, and she has an incredible moment in the last episode, too, during this riot against the cops. But anyway, I read about her. She seems like such an incredible person. I put her on the list of people I wanted to interview. And literally just a week or two later, she passed away. And I ended up finding out on social media because apparently some friends that I knew her from activist circles. She continued to be active in, queer circles and political circles up until her death. And I really regret that I never got to talk to her. I love talking to people who knew her because they all just had so many incredible things to say. And they would sort of get like a dreamy look on their face when they talked about her. Like she was just this mythic figure in addition to being a very real figure. So anyway, I would have loved to talk to Amber Hollabaugh. The thing that surprised me, though, was I had no idea. I maybe had never even heard of this gigantic riot that happened in San Francisco after the conviction of Harvey Milk's killer, which I don't want to give too many details about, why they were rioting, but...
And maybe don't spoil who it was if people don't.
Oh, yeah, no, I definitely won't.
That, it shocked me. I didn't know. I didn't know the Milk story. So hearing that, the whole sweep of that story was, mind-blowing.
I had heard, obviously, about the Stonewall riots. I'd heard about the Compton's Cafeteria riot in San Francisco, which was an uprising of trans women. I feel like riots are very powerful moments in queer history because they show queer people really standing up for themselves in ways that they've been told they can't, that queer people are like weak and too effeminate to ever show real physical strength. And whatever you want to say about political violence, obviously I don't want to encourage violence, but I think they can be very, very powerful stories of people standing up for themselves, especially against people who've committed violence against them, like the police often, who were terrorizing queer people in cities and towns around the country, including in San Francisco. So this riot that thousands of queer people were involved in outside City Hall in San Francisco in May 1979 was something that I couldn't believe I hadn't heard about in queer history. And I actually didn't know how big of a part of the story I could make it when I started reading about it because it definitely gets mentioned in queer histories. There were accounts of it in local newspapers, but it happened as a surprise, as riots often do. It was, something happened that day. People marched down to City Hall, and it turned into a riot against the police, an expression of political anger and disaffection. So I was like, okay, I don't really know how to find a random person who was involved in this. I knew Cleve Jones had been there, and I was going to interview him. But then there was this other woman, Ruth Mahaney, who I just saw her name in someone's dissertation that they had written about the Briggs Initiative. And she had a great quote in that dissertation. So I interviewed her. It was sort of at the end of the interview. And I was like, okay, kind of the last story we're going to tell on this podcast is about this riot. Have you heard about it at the time? And she was like, oh yeah, I was there, and I tried to throw a rock, but it didn't go very far, and I tried to burn a cop car, but the matchbook went out, and I was like, oh my God, you were right in the middle of everything.
I can picture her throwing a brick against a window and it just bounces off.
That's, basically what had happened. She was a very effectual leader, not an effectual committer of vandalism. But she and Cleve Jones, it ended up that they were both kind of right in the middle of the riot and witnessed this pivotal moment where things kind of turn, where it goes from police just beating peaceful protesters, to protesters fighting back. And they both narrate this scene in the podcast from, two different perspectives. And it turned into really one of my favorite segments of the podcast because I think this was a part of the story that, I like to think that a lot of this story has never been told quite in this way before, but especially this riot that I literally didn't even know existed, to be able to tell it in an immersive way that helps us understand why it happened, I think was really powerful, especially because, like I said, the idea of queer people being able to stand up for themselves against folks who are committing violence against them makes me feel really powerful today, and gives me a lot of pride in what people were able to do back then.
Well, maybe, Christina, that's a good way to send people off. Maybe we can end the episode with that moment of the podcast as a teaser, because hopefully people will go check the whole thing out. It's called Slow Burn, Gays Against Briggs. And Christina, thanks a lot for talking to us about it today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
The verdicts just come in for the killings of George Moscone and Harvey Milk, voluntary manslaughter on both counts.
For assassinating two public officials, Dan White was facing less than 8 years in prison. With good behavior, the former cop turned firefighter could get out in 5. His argument that he'd lost control of his emotions, in part because of all the Twinkies he ate, had convinced a jury of his peers. Harvey Milk's intern, Cleve Jones, was gobsmacked, but he pulled himself together enough to share a message with a television reporter.
That's when I said the reaction will be tonight. If you care about justice, come to Castro Street now. And then I went back to my apartment to get the bullhorn.
That bullhorn had a history.
Harvey spoke through many bullhorns over his career, but he only owned one. And it was the one that was given to him by the Teamsters in recognition of his leadership in the Coors Beer boycott. It has a rather prominent dent in it, which came from a police baton at a Teamsters picket line. And then when he got elected, he gave it to me. And he said, I'm going to be inside, you're going to be outside screaming.
Cleve had screamed into that bullhorn at all the marches he'd led in San Francisco over the past year, protesting gay rights defeats across the nation. Now, as the crowd started to build, Cleve took the bullhorn back out and did what Harvey had taught him. Feel what the crowd was feeling and put those emotions into words.
I think today is a really terrible day for the gay people of San Francisco. And I'd like to see us move down to 18th Street and start it from there and get the people out of the bars and into the streets.
By the time the sun had set, thousands of people had gathered at the intersection of Castro and Market.
Out of the bars, into the streets, out of the bars.
From every street, you could see people just running, and some had signs, "Avenge Harvey Milk." You can't even call it a march. It was just the mob roaring down Market Street, screaming bloody murder. Dan White was a cop. Dan White was a cop.
Khalif's plan was to do what he'd done at all those other protests, march them till they drop. Get people out of the Castro and tire them out before they could burn down the neighborhood.
This was the plan. This was the plan we thought we were going to use after we lost the Briggs Initiative. We won Prop 6, so we didn't have to do it. But it was a well-established route of march. Most of the people had done it before. So we get to City Hall, and I'm thinking, we're just going to sweep past it.
That's how it usually went. But this time, they ran into something unexpected. A group of radical lesbians had already posted up at City Hall. They were holding their own rally about race and the death penalty, talking about how black prisoners get executed while Dan White gets a light sentence and eventually a chance at freedom.
There's a generator and a sound system and a stage and these lesbians. And then the people stopped. And I'm thinking, uh-oh, we're not going to just move on.
The crowd was already agitated, and the tension started to escalate.
Police have arrived at City Hall, at the doors of City Hall. They've got riot squad gear on.
San Francisco police officers filed in front of the building. In the process, they knocked over the generator, cutting out the sound system. Everyone who'd marched down from the Castro was now fuming in place, chanting, "All straight jury, no surprise. Dan White lives and Harvey dies."
So we had an angry mob, cops positioning themselves basically as targets right there.
People were milling around in front of City Hall, thousands and thousands and thousands of people.
Lesbian activist Ruth Mahaney had rushed down as soon as she heard the verdict.
A lot of angry people, and there was no sound system.
Without a real sound system, no one could calm down the crowd.
So some rocks start flying, some windows get broken.
I tried to throw a rock, but it was never a softball dike, and my rock didn't go very far, didn't hit anything.
I was pretty much freaking out. A lot of people are chanting, "No more violence, no more violence." Which people, when they see the footage, they often think they're talking about no more violence against gay people. And no, this was gay people saying no more violence. Most of the people there didn't want to riot.
A couple of leaders of the lesbian community came up and said, "Ruth, this is going to turn into a riot." And I said, "Uh-huh." And they said, "You have to stop it." I looked around, there were thousands of people there. I said, "I have to stop it?" I said, "First of all, I don't want to stop it. And secondly, I can't stop it."
And then Amber Hollabaugh gets the bullhorn.
I talked about Amber Hollabaugh in a previous episode. She was the high femme working class lesbian who drove out to small towns to talk to voters about Proposition 6.
Amber stood up on the steps of City Hall and gave an amazing speech.
It's time we stood up for each other. That's what Harvey meant to us. He wasn't some big leader. He was one of us.
We have a right to be angry. This was not justice.
I don't think it's wrong for us to feel like we do. I think we should feel like it more often. Don't just listen to anybody that tells you you don't need to fight back for nothing yourself.
And then all hell broke loose.
That was the opening segment of the 7th and last episode of Slow Burn Season 9, Gays Against Briggs. Turn around, fight back. And you can hear the rest of that amazing episode and the rest of that incredible series wherever you listen to podcasts. And thanks for joining me on Relationscapes, where we're mapping the stories and ideas that shape who we are and how we connect with each other in order to build a more just world. And there's more to come soon. For Pride Month, I'm releasing 3 full episodes instead of the customary 2, so you've got another episode coming your way this month. And if this episode meant something to you, let me know. You can leave a rating or review in Apple Podcasts. You can rate the show in Spotify. You can pass the episode along to a friend. Mates of State provided our theme song. Relationscapes is part of the Dialogue Podcast Network. I'm journalist Blair Hodges in Salt Lake City, and I'll see you again very soon.